Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host. And today we are going to be talking about language. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the language of organizing, classifying chocolate, and also other foods and beverages that we think about in very, very similar terms, like beer and wine and cheese, for example. And people who are regular visitors or regular readers of what it is that I talk about on The Chocolate Life understand that I think language is really important. The words that we use are really important. Words inform our beliefs, beliefs inform our actions, action have consequences. And we don't need to be thinking about ethics or morality or transparency, equity. These same ideas apply to things like the words we use for flavor and how we arrive at them. And then how do we structure classification systems? And specifically, if we're going to judge chocolate, does it make sense to have a classification system first? And that classification system can inform how we educate people about chocolate, how we evaluate the various properties of chocolate, and then how we might go about creating a competition judging framework for chocolate. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. It sounds like deeply technical, and it is in a way, but if you're a language geek, a language nerd like I am, I think you will find it pretty compelling. And I'm going to jump into it after I take care of two bits of housekeeping. The first one of which is that no matter where you're watching, you can go into the live chat on YouTube, you can go to the comments on LinkedIn and Facebook, and you can ask me a question or just put a comment out there. Let me know what you're thinking. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know, and I will get the comment or the question up on screen, and I will do the best that I can do to make sure to answer that question. The other one is that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members of The Chocolate Life. And this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life right now. You'll notice I'm logged into that. So let's go to this page where I'm not logged in. There's a join button up here. And you can go to that join button. There is always a free membership tier. There has been since I founded The Chocolate Life in 2008. But if you do have the resources to support the work that I'm doing, then there are plans which start at $5 a month to help me produce these episodes and keep The Chocolate Life online. And with that, I will also point out that for every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I produce a post on The Chocolate Life. And this is the post for today's episode 217. Before judging can begin, typology, classification, and taxonomy. This is a run of show. These are unscripted. And so this is the order that I'm going to talk about things. So 2 episodes ago, I had an entire episode devoted to evaluating chocolate, the what, the why, and the how. And the focus of that episode was in flavor networks and flavor classification systems, the way we describe flavor, not only the terms we use, but the format and the structure of the visual representations for the flavors that we use. So this one here, let me get this a little bigger. This one here is for the International Institute of Chocolate and Cacao Tasting. This one here is used on the Beanstalker platform. Here are some pages from the IICCT Level 2 document, which goes into depth about this structure. This is the underlying neurological basis for the creation of this map. And then we have other wheels. So the one over here is from Chocolatras Online from Brazil. This one, again, is the Beanstalker wheel, and the flag classification system we have over here is the one from the Cacao of Excellence. So these are different ways of listing flavors, deciding which flavors are important, and then creating a hierarchy. Here's a main flavor category, here's a sub-flavor category, and then perhaps, so we might have fruity, and then red fruit, and then cherries. So there's a hierarchy associated with them. And the number of divisions changes, the number of hierarchies changes this is a flavor lexicon, and it turns out that when we have a system that is set up to assume that flavor is where we want to begin when we talk about chocolate, then all of these make sense. And I might want to I ask the question during this episode, is flavor where we want to begin? I mean, it is important. Flavor is important, but is it the most important thing? And people might look at me and they might say, hey, Clay, you're crazy. And if you think I'm crazy, let me know in the comments, right? And I will get it up on screen. But if you think I'm crazy to think that there might be another way to think about chocolate, first, let me know. Because based on my research, maybe there is. But in any event, let's go back to the page for today's episode. And immediately I noticed a typo. I've been looking at this for the last couple of days. There's a typo here. So again, should flavor be the linchpin of classification, education, and competition judging? So before I get there, I want to talk about what is the differentiation between taste, aroma, and flavor. And that's what's in this box here. Taste, aroma, and flavor are interconnected sensory experiences. Taste refers to the sensations detected in the tongue and the mouth, right? Aroma is perceived in the nose, and flavor is what we use to describe both taste and aroma together. So, and as I say here, flavor is always assumed to be the appropriate starting point. It's never been questioned when it comes to chocolate, to the best of my knowledge, right? But if I'm starting from ground zero, right, what are the implications of starting from a different place and proceeding toward different goals? And my goal here is that rather than start from a system that begins dark milk white and works backwards to something, and where do we fit cacao juice and alternative cocoa and things like that into that framework? Can we come up with a defensible linguistic foundation out of which things like dark and milk and white and liquor and butter and powder and nibs and beans and juice and flour, which is ground pods, just sort of naturally fall out, right? And so, again, why, right? And that's because every other major food and beverage that we can think of, right, which is judged globally. And by that, I mean beer, wine, spirits, coffee, cheese, balsamic vinegar. All of those foods and beverages have that underpinning. They have this philosophical underpinning. So if we take, for example, and I'm going to jump ahead of myself here in terms of the run of show, is that in 1977, let's say to this, because I'm not following the script. In 1977, Michael Jackson published a book called The World Guide to Beer. Now, The World Guide to Beer is a narrative. It's descriptive. It is, in some sense, rooted in a personal discovery. Jackson is talking about beers in large part based upon places in the world that he's visited. And he's created a nearly encyclopedic travelogue in which he classifies beers. He's got some top-level styles, and he's got some attributes which are attributed to these styles. And it is the first time in beer where there's been this considered rethinking of the way we organize beers into categories, right? And so that was revolutionary in beer, and it set the stage for the craft beer movement. And eventually, after a book, the author's name is Eckhart. I've got it in the notes later. Eckhart did some systematization of what it is that Michael Jackson did about a decade later. And then out of Michael Jackson and Eckhart came the beer judging certification program, in which there's now we've moved from a literary description to a formal competition judging system. And we have similar ideas. We have similar ideas for cheese. We have similar ideas for wine, but we only have ad hoc, not philosophically considered, in my opinion, classification systems, nomenclature for chocolate. There's legal nomenclature in things like the Code of Federal Regulations 21.163, the Codex Alimentarius. There is similar regulations in Canada and the UK and other places in the world. But the legal definition in the TTB, the Tobacco and Tax Bureau, which covers beer, alcohol in the United States, is a very different discipline from what it is that's being done in wine judging and beer judging and spirits judging. And so are we going to create a classification system that's rooted in the legal framework in CFR 21.163? And to do that, in other words, we need to take a look at what is the evolution of 21.163. So, for example, white chocolate only became a legally defined type of chocolate at the top level of the hierarchy, right? In 2004. So Nestle introduced white chocolate in the late 1930s, 36 to 1937, with the Milka bar. But there was never any formal definition for it, what actually white chocolate was. And it's really important to know that the chocolate section, 21.163, didn't enter into the Code of Federal Regulations until the 1970s. So even though white chocolate might have been developed in the late 1930s and wasn't officially recognized as a type until 2004, although work had been being done in front of the FDA, petitions in front of the FDA to make this classification system. The gap between when the classification was created for cacao products and when white chocolate was added was only about 30 years, not 70 or more. But it's important when we think about these things, right? How are we going about creating a classification system? Does it make sense to just follow the one that evolved over the course of 30 years to changing industry demand, which is what we have in 21.163 in the Code of Federal Regulations? Should we take a system which sort of understands that classification system and then modifies it slightly changing terms, reparenting? So reparenting is moving one subcategory to another category, but that evolves over time, again, out of, as much as anything, industry usage, right? Or should we start from the very beginning? And my proposition, and the work that I've been doing now off and on for 3 years or so now, is to think about starting from a new beginning. And one of the places that I'm beginning is doing research into how did the classification systems for beer and wine and spirits and coffee and cheese evolve. What is it the American Cheese, what did the American Cheese Society do in the creation of their competition judging system, right? And how does it fit into concepts like protected designations of origin, geographic indicators? I mean, these are complex interrelationships. We find, perhaps developed more completely, more comprehensively in wine, right? There are, I think, 2 denominations for cocoa, right? So Chuao and Arriba. So Chuao in Venezuela and Arriba in Ecuador, but there are no denominations for chocolate, for example. How are the denominations for balsamic vinegar? So how is the classification system divided? And it turns out geographically for the most part. So we have balsamic vinegar, which comes from Modena, and balsamic vinegar, which comes from Emilia-Reggiano. And those are 2 of the 3 top level classifications for balsamic vinegar. And what we have what do we have for cocoa and chocolate? And the answer is we don't have anything similar. And I am proposing to, well, I am doing the work, and I will come up with a proposal to fix that problem. But where do we begin, right? Again, this is a language question. And what language are we going to be using, and how are we going to be using it? So again, getting geeky from a language perspective, the first thing we want to understand, the first thing that I needed to understand, and what's really interesting to me is that when I started putting together my classification system, I made the classic mistake that the original organizers of beer and wine and spirits categories did, right? I took an existing vocabulary and I was just thinking about how do I resolve the overlaps and inconsistencies. So I was working from something finished towards something which was more structured and more organized. And what I really needed to do is I really needed to start from a different place. And that different place is called typology specifically. And so typology is a conceptual framework, and it is deductive. What you do is you reason from principles to categories. You don't reason from categories to principles, right? The categories are ideal types. Nothing in the world instantiates them perfectly. And this is really important because what you're doing is you're going back to first principles. You're not saying, is dark chocolate a type of chocolate? Is milk chocolate a type of chocolate? I mean, dark is not legally a type of chocolate anywhere. It's a subset of sweet chocolate. And so if you're going to accommodate dark chocolate in as a classification system, where does it fit in a clean conceptual framework, in a clean conceptual typology map, right? So typology is conceptual and deductive. Classification is operational. What it does, it is the act of putting a real object into a bin. And in this case, the bin is standing in for category or subcategory. You're putting dark into a category. You're putting dark milk into a category. You're putting single origin to ingredient into category or categories. So if you don't have a conceptual framework on top of which to build these things, it's how do you do that in a fashion that's consistent, right? And it carries obligations that typologies don't, right? So a classification system, right, has to be exhaustive, which means that every entry has to be put somewhere, right? Decidability, which is a judge must resolve the classification in seconds from the object in front of them. Here's this, it's a red wine. Here is this, it is a lager. Here is a milk chocolate, right? So the classification has to be decidable. It's harder in chocolate because, if you're just looking at it, you might not know what's inside. So because it's opaque, but that's a different issue. And usually exclusivity, if I have something in front of me, eventually it can only end up in one category or be described by category, subcategory in a straight line tree, and it exists only in that categorization system, right? And that's where taxonomy comes in. So taxonomy is imperial and deductive. Categories abstracted from reserved cases. So the taxonomy is going to be the words that we use and the organization of the words we use that are the results of the classification process. We have all of these things in front of us. These things exist independently, but we want to put them into a hierarchy, right? That's the classification process, right? And then when we get done, we put names on all of these things, and that the names and their structure, their hierarchy, is the taxonomy that we put together. There's a challenge here, as I say, is that in English, classification can be both the act of sorting and the resulting scheme. And it's easy to equivocate between those two usages of the word classification without really noticing. And by equivocate, what we mean here is that you use the word one way in one part of a sentence and then you use the word in the other sense in another part of the sentence or in the same paragraph. So we could use classification in to denote two very, very different things. There are two very different acts, and really not be aware that we're doing it. That's one of the ways that language works, right? But in English, classification has that particular issue. So typologies don't have that problem, right? It's only ever a product, never an act, right? So typology is the act of sorting, not actually the results of the sorting, whereas a classification is both the act and the results, okay? So the challenge when we get to competition judging is that the language distinction reveals classification pressure, right? And the classification pressure is that every entry must be placed in exactly one category, right? So is this a plain dark origin bar as opposed to a flavored milk origin bar? Everything has got to be in a single category, right? With or without inclusions. How does that fit into the concept of flavored? These are all issues related to competition judging. Every entry needs to be put into a category. That requirement, right, just deforms. I have a typology, and if my typology isn't carefully constructed, the act of classification, right, especially in the competition, will just play havoc on the cleanliness, I want to say purity. Those are both bad terms. I can't come up with better ideas for at the moment. But that typology should be able to stand on its own, and you shouldn't have to adjust the typology to match the classification. And that's what that means. That if I have to put, right, everything into a category, we need to be careful that in the process of classification, we're not pulling apart the typology, right? So the fastest way to guarantee exhaustiveness is to promote whatever distinguishes an awkward entry, right? So milk type, geography, smoke, genetics, whatever, and just pull it up to the top rank, right? So being exhaustive, right, is one of the issues associated with this. How do we accommodate all the different entries we have in the system? And then in the case of competitions, that exhaustiveness can't be so fine that we end up with only one entry in a category. So we need to be back up or conflate categories together so that we can have a sufficient number of entries, so that if there's only one entry in a category, right, can you give it there's nothing to compare it with. Can you give it a gold, a silver, a bronze? How do you go about doing that if there's only one? So you need to organize the categories so that there are enough entries in each category in order to make it worth judges. And that's another classification pressure that has the issue of, we're going to use integrity rather than purity. That will disrupt the integrity of the typology. So a good system isn't one that keeps its axes clean. It's one that does its typology first and derives the classification from it. And this is where I've been doing a lot of my work, understanding what are the elements of the typology and the top level categories that fall naturally out of the typology. And it turns out that how you do that is not very, very clear. It's also hard to derive by taking a look at how has beer done it? How has wine done it? How has cheese done it? So this is what I've been working on in this area. And that's why I took a look at the flavor stuff in episode 215. It's why I'm going to be looking this coming Tuesday at the International Institute of Chocolate Cacao Tasting and what they're doing. These all fall into, well, and not just IICCT, but the Academy of Chocolate has got similar kinds of issues with what they're doing, right? But I think that this is absolutely necessary for the future of education evaluation and competition judging for chocolate going forward, is to have a defensible typology, to have a categorization system, a classification system that arises defensibly and cleanly, with as little ambiguity and as few overlaps as possible from the typology to the classification. And that, as it turns out, is non-trivial, but I think it's really, really important. So there are three other things that we need to think about this. The first one of which is that I want to avoid what we call a residual bin, which we can think of as everything else. So here are 97 categories, and it covers 99% of everything, but here's one thing that doesn't fit, so we're just going to put it into a category that says miscellaneous or something like that, right? So the important thing is that if your typology is correctly structured, there is never a residual bin, right? We tolerate cells that are empty in the typology. They're fine because the objects are unclassified, right? But a computation classification system acquires a residual bin the moment entry fees stop being refundable. And this is just a generic observation. It's not something that I'm going to put on any specific competition system. But you need to find a place to put all these things that don't fit into a classification system which grew up in an ad hoc fashion. How do you tell if it grew up over an ad hoc fashion? Is that if you look at the category structure, for example, in 1 year, 2015, and you look at the category structure in 2015, are they the same? If they're different or they're not clean, right? It turns out that the classification structure grew out of this notion of promotion. So a modifier, right? So plain, origin, dark, rate, whatever, right? Gets raised to a higher level, right? Because a flight needed it or a category needed it, right? And so when we're thinking about typologies, what we're looking for to have is a typology with integrity in which promotion is not required. And then there are extrinsic axes. And so for an example, an extrinsic axis in wine might be the price. We might segregate a $20 bottle of wine from a $200 bottle of wine because we might think it's unfair somehow to put a $20 bottle of wine against a $200 wine, thinking that the $20 bottle of wine can't compete, right? I think Robert Parker in the 1970s, when he showed that California wines could compete against French wines, right? Before then, you wouldn't have put California wines and French wines in the same flight, in the same category for judging, because there was just this assumption that French wine was better and California wine would not be able to compete, right? In the same category, in the same flight against each other. And we learned in the 1970s that that was not the case, right? So price is an extrinsic category. Is cocoa percentage an extrinsic category? Is origin an extrinsic category? Interesting question, right? That needs to be discussed, right? Because it hasn't been discussed. It's just been assumed, right? So again, as I say, over the past 3 years now, I've been exploring the classification systems for, right, as I say, beer, wine, spirits, coffee, balsamic vinegar, cheese, and chocolate to understand where they started and how they evolved, right? How they are the same and how they differ, right? How they influence education and certification, right? Really, really important. Does the classification system drive the way we think about how we evaluate and then how we educate people and then how we go through certification programs? And the answer is they absolutely do, right? Right. You wouldn't. So again, the beer judge certification program took the work that had been done by Jackson and Eckhart and formalized it and then put it into structures, gave them attributes, for example, like IBU, International Bitterness Units, and then put numbers on those, right? And it also said, well, alcohol content, what is the alcohol content for a session, IPA, for example, right? It gave a numerical range for that. And when you go into competition, you enter it not just as an IPA, but as a session IPA, so that you're judging 3.5% beers against 3.5% beers, not 3.5% beers against 10% beers. It makes sense in a competition judging, but how do we do that in chocolate is the question. And then how the classification systems, not just education certification, but evaluation and judging. So, right. So there's a link here to the Beer Judge Certification Program homepage. You can go if you want to know more about what it's all about. Their guidelines plainly say that they're written for competition, not as a beer encyclopedia. So Jackson's World Guide to Beer in 1977, as I said, was narrative and descriptive, almost a travelogue in some respects. Fred Eckhart's, I'm sorry, I forgot the first name, Essentials of Beer Style, a decade later, sits in between Jackson's book and the Beer Judge Certification Program guidelines. It converted Jackson's prose into a more systematic catalog, and then the BJCP came last, adding numeric rigor, right? But getting geeky, looking at this, look at some edge cage examples. So 34C experimental beer is a residual bin. It's a, what do we do with all these beers that don't fit into these classification systems? Well, we have this experimental beer category, and if it doesn't fit any these categories, we're just going to put it into the experimental categories, where you might have entirely different experiments competing against each other with no clear understanding of how do you determine exactly what you're judging and what is a good example of an experimental beer. I don't know how you would go about doing that, right? But there's another category, not just 34C, but category 7, historical beer. And so, for example, an historical beer might be a Groot beer. And Groot beers were common before the introduction, before the introduction of hops, in which case some sort of plant like rosemary, which has got antioxidant components in it, were added to beer as preservatives. All right, and when hops were introduced to beer, it turns out that not only were they a flavoring agent, but they were a preservation agent, while also adding bitterness, which is part of flavoring and part of the preservative properties. So an historical beer, for example, might be a Groot beer. Those exist because those kinds of beers don't get entered enough to warrant a unique category name. So we're not going to put it, at the upper level here. So here are 5 of the Beer Judge Certification Program top level categories. How would you put an historical Czech lager, an historical standard American beer, an experimental Czech lager? You can see that there's a definition for what a Czech lager is if you want to enter it into competition. And what judges are doing is they're saying, here's a Czech lager. I know what the characteristics of a Czech lager are supposed to be. If I know what the grain bill is going to be, the malt bill is going to be, I know what the hop bill is going to be. I have some idea about where the alcohol is going to be. Is it top fermented? It's a lager, so I know what kind of beer and what kind of yeast and what kind of temperature it was fermented at. I know all of these things, and so the first place I look is this entry in front of me a well-made example of Czech lager, right? And then I can go and take a look at, do I like it, right? So the judging is different from the way other beverages and foods are categorized and judged. And this is why classification systems are really, really important when it comes to judging. And the fact that there is no single accepted judging protocol anywhere for chocolate means that 2 competitions are measuring 2 different things, might be measuring the same chocolate, might be assessing, evaluating, judging the same chocolate, but if they're using different rubrics, they're going to come to different results. right? And when for the same chocolate. And this is what we find. If a chocolate is entered at the International Chocolate Awards, it might get one result, and if the same chocolate is entered in the Academy of Chocolate Awards, it might get a different result. That same chocolate could be entered in the Good Foods Awards, the Chocolate Alliance Northwest Chocolate Festival Awards, and it will be judged differently. Some will rate it high, it won't reach the podium. So that's one of the issues. The beer judge the beer judging guidelines are designed, the beer judge certification program. Did I get this wrong? BJCP? I did. I got this. I'm going to have to go back and fix this. I've been running this morning to update this, but you get the idea that without this sort of level of rigorous classification, or as rigorous as we can classification, we can't compare the results. Oh, this beer got this result in this competition. The same beer got an entirely different result in another competition. If the judging guidelines are identical, then there will be slight differences, but there shouldn't be major differences in terms of the results in the competition. So wine is a little bit different, right? So as I said, major wine competitions don't always flight by appellation, where the wine is coming from. Sometimes they flight by variety. So we're going to compare all the Cabernet Franc against the Cabernet Sauvignon versus Merlot versus some other grape, Pinot Noir, right? And we use the Merlot and Pinot Noir example because of the movie Sideways, right? So price is an extrinsic property of what's in the glass. And I already mentioned that. The assumption is that a $14 Cabernet can't fairly compete against a $250 Cabernet, right? The point that I would make is that may be true. I don't necessarily believe that it's true, citing the California example. If we had flighted by origin, France versus California, right, then we might not have ever come to the realization in 1977 that the 1970s, that the California wine industry was producing wine that could compete against the best French wines in the world and beat them, right? Under blind tasting conditions, right? But if we never flighted dissimilar things, we might never make these really, really important observations. So while in a competition setting, maybe it doesn't make sense to compare $20 wines with $200 wines, as individuals, when we get together, it might make an enormous amount of sense. There might be a huge amount that we can learn, right? But the important question for chocolate is, are we flighting, are we organizing our competitions and our category structures based around the notion of price? And the answer is not yet. Although, right, we do have competitions that force the entrants to discriminate between, I made this chocolate from beans and I bought couverture chocolate from a manufacturer. And I'm usually bonbons, but it could be flavored bars or bars with inclusions, right? And so does price, or does this distinction between I made it myself and somebody else made it for me, where does that fit into a classification structure? It's not very, very clear. But what we have to do is understand that this flighting by price, right, is an example of no typological standing, right? There's no philosophical underpinning for it, right? It's there because judging requires it. And that's really, 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 really important to understand. Is the classification there because, right, the way we're judging things demands that it needs to be there? And often that is the case. If I look at the way chocolate competition categories have expanded over the course of decades, it's that the judging requirements, it's often having to do with this notion of, oh, if I only have 2 entries in a category, I'm too narrowly defined. I need to step back up a level of my classification system. Oh, and all of a sudden I've got 20. Well, that's enough. That's enough entries to be able to judge against. So another way in which wine works is it treats sweetness as a cross-cutting style. So, right. So I might think about a wine, right, in terms of color. It's going to be red or white. It's going to be rosé. It could be still. It could be sparkling. It could be fortified, right? I can do it by varietal, grape type. I can do it by appellation, where the grape was grown, where the vineyard, where the winery is located, right? What happens is these are like separate classification dimensions, and rather than trying to put them into a single hierarchy, the label actually sorts out by listing all of them, right? This is Trockenbarent Auslese. It's a sparkling, right? It is made with this grape, and it comes from this part of Germany or Austria, for example, right? And they're not a single classification systems. There are multiple classification systems running in parallel. And one of the challenges, those definitions can change by the country. Does that make sense in terms of chocolate? Or does it make sense to not have a single category, a single hierarchy, right? But to think of we have multiple axes, right? And they're going to run in parallel, and we're going to list them on the label. If there were a government regulatory authority behind the labeling, then the answer is that might make sense, because it is the terms themselves are well understood. In chocolate, we do have a regulatory authority in the United States, CFR 21.163, in which it says this is what it means to be a white chocolate, this is what it means to be a milk chocolate, this is what it means to be a sweet chocolate, but there's no definition for dark chocolate. Right? And so immediately we run into a regulatory issue. There is no formal classification, for example, for a chocolate made with non-dairy milk. So if you want to do it with almond milk or macadamia milk or some other milk, there's no formal classification for that in CFR 21.163. As a matter of fact, you could say under the terms of CFR 21.163, an alternative milk, almond milk, coconut milk, chocolate is not legal. You can't actually put that term on the front of the label. So, does it make sense to have multiple separate classification axes in which that are running simultaneously? I think without a much more highly detailed, highly classified, legally enforceable structure, right? There's no organization in chocolate. The FCIA doesn't have the legal authority to do this or the size to do this. The World Cocoa Foundation is not focused on chocolate that way. Is there an organization that could do this that would be listened to by both industrial chocolate makers and specialty craft chocolate makers? The answer is absolutely not, right? So there's no organizational behind it. There's no organizational push behind it. There's no organizational authority behind it that would make it possible. And then we have to resolve the differences between the fact that in the EU, you can have up to 5% non-cocoa butter fats and still label it chocolate, whereas in the United States and in Canada, you cannot, right? And so that's going to make it incredibly hard to have multiple classification systems or classification axes running in parallel. There's just no structure to enforce them. So in spirits, we run into a slightly different problem, which is really interesting from a nomenclature perspective. So we have this New Western contemporary gin category, right, which is not recognized by the TTB. The TTB is the government authority in the United States that regulates alcohol and tobacco. So wine and beer spirits, all three of them fall under the purview of the TTB. And there are very, very specific classifications in the TTB for what does it mean to be a bourbon? What does it mean to be a scotch? What does it mean to be a gin? Right? And it has what does it mean to be a tequila? And how is a tequila different from a mezcal? right? What are, at what point does it classify as a liqueur, right? And not as a liqueur. And it's all of this is within the purview of the TTB. I learned more than I cared to know about this, bringing Solbesso to market, 2011, 2017, because what we were making didn't easily fit within the TTB classification system. It ended up, it could have been a cognac because it was made from fruit, right? Or it could have been what's called DSS, which is the residual category for everything that doesn't have a clear place to put. We're going to put it in what's called DSS, distilled specialty spirits. But within the judging world, right, not the TTB, not the legal framework, right, a term like New Western or contemporary, right, was created because the classic definition for gin judging was around juniper forwardness, because juniper is one of the primary flavoring in gin and its predecessors, Genever, things like that, right? And so if you're creating a gin, right, for example, Hendrix or Aviation, they didn't deliberately, intentionally, didn't have a juniper forward character. And so if you put them in a competition where one of the primary judging criteria was juniper, right, it turns out that they would never be able to win. So they created a new category, right? But what's important to understand about this category, right, it's that it's negative. It is defined by the absence of something. It is defined by the absence of juniper, right? So it was born at the judging table, right? It's born a part of competition judging. And it was later rationalized backward into a style with this story, right? And so do we do this with chocolate? And the answer is, I think we do, right? And that's one of the sort of edge cases. So an example of it in chocolate is if we were to think of artificial chocolate. So we can talk about artificial chocolate is anything that's made with a cocoa alternative. Doesn't matter if it's, well, we might put cell cultured cocoa in there. We would certainly put fermented precision or natural fermented cocoa alternatives in there, right? But anything made with them is defined by the absence of tree grown cocoa, right? And so that's a negative category. And the question becomes in chocolate, is that how we're going to do this? So we're going to say, here's an entire category, and we're defining the category by what it's not or what it's missing, right? And and can we develop a typology structure which is going to make that exception in what is otherwise a clean category structure necessary? My goal of working from a typology forward rather than a classification backwards, or from judging to classification, is to see if we can make sure that we're not doing a category based on what it isn't. So it's a subtle point, but I think it's a really, really important point moving forward. Anyway, so for example, if I have a cocoa butter that is nature identical, if I'm using precision fermentation or something else, and I'm looking at cocoa butter, the fat, as just the fat, then I might say it's cocoa butter, right? Because you can't distinguish it. However, if I'm using fava beans to create a cocoa alternative, I can say that's not cocoa, right? To do that, but how do you fit that into a larger structure, right? It's not as obvious as it seems. Right? So I said, here are some 5 top-level categories for beer. So standard American, these are taken straight from the beer judge certification program. Standard American, International Lager, Czech Lager, Pale Malty European, Pale Bitter European, right? If we go down to cheese, here's something that stands out that's different about cheese, which is we're really talking about the texture of the cheese. How soft is it? How hard is it? Fresh, unripened cheese, soft, ripened cheese, all right? Cheddars. These are descriptors which revolve around the texture of the cheese. And if we take a look at the top level ACS, American Cheese Society, judging and competition categories, we can make that observation about all the top levels, right? And what's interesting about this is that they're not consistent because there are two attributes. One attribute is smoky, and the other attribute is flavored. And what they do is they take smoky and flavored and put them at the same level as fresh, soft, and cheddars. So smoky cheeses. Whereas I could take a fresh unripened cheese and flavor it. I could add lemon to it, for example, right? I could have a soft unripened cheese and smoke it. I have smoked cheddar. I have flavored cheddars, right? So smoked and flavored aren't types of cheeses. They're modifiers, right, that can be applied. Are they types? And the answer is no. Do we do this in chocolate, right? Might we say that this kind of chocolate, or do we want to avoid taking a particular chocolate and say, well, they're fundamentally at the top level, there's a difference between a 2-ingredient chocolate and a 3-ingredient chocolate, right? Does that, are we going to take these attributes, these modifiers, these descriptors is the term that I would use, and are we going to promote them from a subcategory to a top level category? Is there something fundamentally different about 2 ingredients as opposed to 3 ingredients? And that deserves to throw up at the top level. The same thing is true of single origin. Does it deserve to be promoted to the top level? And that's why starting from a defensible typology and moving towards a classification system is the harder way, but it is the correct way to arrive at what we're doing, right? Rather than trying to take a comprehensive, well, as comprehensive as possible narrative description, which is what Michael Jackson put together, then have somebody look at what Jackson did and systematize it, which is what Fred Eckhart did in 1989, and then have a group of people, let's go take what Fred Eckhart did and really systematize it and put numbers associated with it. There's no such evolution there is no such evolution in chocolate. People who are organizing large competitions haven't done that systematized examination of what chocolate is, right? So a clean typology doesn't eliminate classification pressure, right? What it does is it gives us somewhere defensible to put something that doesn't easily fit into an existing category and let us name things that don't fit into categories easily, right? Instead of moving it into its own category. This is the point. There's a sense in which the quote people remember is consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And in this particular case, it's a foolish consistency, which is the original full quote. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. Are we making this decision just to be consistent for consistency's sake, even when it doesn't make sense? And that's where the notion of foolish consistency comes into. You want the typology which is flexible enough to be able to accommodate things that don't easily fall into a more conventional classification system by recognizing, right, that a very, very tightly controlled vocabulary, which is what a classification system is, or classification systems often are, usually are, right, that a very tightly controlled vocabulary might run into issues. For example, it may be true from a neurological perspective that vanilla and vanillin or vanillin fit under banana, right? And if you go look at the IICCT, vanilla is placed with banana. If you go look at the Beanstalker wheel, it's placed under banana. That's not a very intuitive assessment. It may make sense in terms of chemical structure, right? But it doesn't make sense in terms of how language is structured. So it is consistent to put it there for one reason, but is it a foolish consistency because it makes using the vocabulary harder? And this is something that you find in many, many vocabularies, not just the two that I mentioned. But if I'm putting together a system, I want to be able to put together a typology which gets us to a classification system that can be applied to a flavor lexicon, right? Which is, so can we be consistent across it? And that will help us when it comes to evaluating chocolate, right? Educating people about how to taste chocolate, right? And then how we're going to judge chocolate in competitions. So again, little history. In the previous episode 215, What, Why, How, I asked if flavor assessment should be the first point of entry for assessing chocolate. Flavor is important, but is it the most important, right, thing? I'm going to, through all the work that I've done, I've come to the conclusion, right, that as with almost everything having to do with chocolate, it depends. And in this particular case, in the case of flavor, it depends on who the audience is, right? Is flavor the most important thing for a consumer? Is flavor the most important thing for a hobbyist chocolate maker? Is flavor the most important thing for a professional? The answer is, if I'm a flavor professional, the answer is yes, of course, flavor is the most important thing. If I'm on the process line trying to figure out how to make something, is flavor the most important thing? It's going to be a component. I want to make sure I end up at a flavor, the definition of industrial. I start out with the end goal in mind, right? But if I'm a craft chocolate maker, yes, very, very much flavor is very, very important. But is it the first place we should go when we're talking about evaluating chocolate? Is flavor the most important thing? Is it the first thing that we should be examining, right? My thought has long been that we start from the notion of, is this a well-made example of the type and style of chocolate, which is the beer approach, right? This chocolate has been entered into, for example, the Czech lager category. Here is a list of characteristics, attributes, and a range of measurements for each of those attributes. And I can, once I have subjectively determined that these are the standards, right, that we're going to judge a Czech lager, I can go and assess the particular entry against that standard. Is it a good example of Czech lager? Now, flavor is an assessment. It's a part of the assessment of it. Do I like it? Right? But the first thing is this, does this meet the criteria for being a Czech lager in the first place? So it's a different way of thinking, but I think it's important, right? It's also important to understand that these typologies, these classifications and taxonomies do not arise out of thin air. However, when it comes to chocolate, the ones that are currently in use have evolved more out of necessity to solve challenges associated with judging, rather than starting from a systematic exploration of typology or an understanding of how other beverages and food have addressed the issues. Now, that may not be strictly true. The way people are thinking about how to approach chocolate judging seems to be very, very much rooted in wine judging, right? So people think about the Wine Spirits Education Trust, WSET, and what it does, and it appears that the approach to evaluation and education is very, very much rooted in the way we think about wine, right? And one of the challenges with wine is that chocolate is closer to cheese. Wine doesn't have fat in it. Coffee might have a small amount of oil in it, but right, it's not a fatty product the way chocolate and cheese are. The same thing is true of beer, next to no fat in beer. And so should we be adopting an approach which is based upon the way wine is judged, right, to evaluate or evaluated for chocolate? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? But I don't think it has been challenged enough in order to be able to figure out doing it. So the question is, if you were to put together a classification system for chocolate, where would dark milk chocolate go? Would it be a category of dark chocolate, or it would be a subcategory of milk chocolate, right? There are arguments either way. You could put a dark milk chocolate under dark. You could put a dark milk chocolate under milk. I think it more naturally fits in one place over the other. You tell me where you think it, should belong. But it turns out that the criteria used to make this decision, right, need to be applied consistently across all the other categories. So if it's a subset of dark, why? If it's a subset of milk, why? Right? But then how do we take that notion and say, what does percent cocoa content mean? Right? So within the context of dark chocolate, are we going to differentiate between 90 and above, 70 to 90, below 70? And are we going to do that? Are there going to be categories which fit between them, which there's now a there are now subcategories of dark chocolate and subcategories of sweet chocolate, but there are already subcategories of sweet chocolate called bittersweet and semi-sweet, which don't have real formal definitions, right? But they do exist as names. And why would we not? So how are we going to differentiate between those things in ways that make an enormous amount of sense? So how does percent cocoa content fit? Is it, a subtype? Is it a style of dark chocolate? Is it a style of sweet chocolate? A style of milk chocolate? It turns out that it's important to understand where these things go. Where does 2-ingredient fit? And 2-ingredient can mean cacao and sugar, but it could also mean cacao and milk. Zotter has an 80-20 bar where it's 80% cacao and 20% milk. They have a 70-30 bar. So a 2-ingredient bar might be, 70% cacao, 30% sugar. It could be 70% cacao and 30% milk. There's a Cuisel. I don't remember the name of it. Maybe it's Noir Infini, although it's been a while since I thought about it. But it's a 99% with 1% flavoring, bergamot. Could I have a 99% chocolate which is 1% vanilla, right? So high cocoa content. So how do we go think about this, right? Should we be judging a 70% chocolate in which the other 30% is sugar, as opposed to if it's milk powder? Where do we put those things? If we're going to have cocoa content as a high level descriptor, it's really important that we think about these things, right? Where does single origin fit, right? So we're going to put single origin, right, at the top level descriptor, right? And somehow a single origin chocolate is different, substantially different from a blended chocolate, that we should judge it differently. We should evaluate it differently. That's a question. But if you're going to make the decisions like, is dark milk a milk or is dark milk a dark, right? Then we have to think about all of the other kinds of decisions we're making and how to go about doing them, right? And then I've got this notion of, competition categories like plain origin dark, right? And even if we throw bars in there, so bars is a descriptor about format as opposed to bonbons. Whoa! So we're conflating we're conflating type and style and provenance descriptor terms, right? So I don't think it's necessarily the bad thing. It's just the order in which we're doing things. I would like them to be consistent. The hierarchy of use of the terms be consistent, in which case it would be dark and then plain as opposed to unflavored, right? And then origin is where the name of where the beans come from is on it. So I would like it. Do we want it to be a bottom up or a top down descriptor? I'm not entirely. The answer is I'm less concerned about the order than if the order is consistently applied in the context of things. So we do need to go look through all the descriptors and find out, are they mixing and matching descriptors or terms that fit at different levels of the hierarchy, and what is the order of them, and things like that. Again, I don't think it's necessarily, we don't need to prescribe the order of these things, just that within any competition, they be in the same order consistently, how they're used. So here are the next steps, all right, for me, and what we're going to take away from this. So when I spun up Chocophile in 2001, one of my primary concerns, or one of the things that I noticed, and one of the activities that I wanted to work on, was that I'm going to move away from this, right? Because it's in the post, and you can go read the post. So when I spun up Chocophile in 2001, one of my primary concerns is that I noticed that there was a large body of writing around wine and beer and spirits and coffee and cigars and architecture. I mean, there was that each one of these things had a large body of works that fit in what I thought of as a genre of literary criticism. And so part of what it is that I wanted to do with chocophile.com is start developing this body of writing for this genre of literary criticism around chocolate, not just factual history or factual research, or speaking just about, ooh, I taste cherries in this chocolate, or ooh, I taste tropical fruit in this chocolate, but to sort of expand the range of, oh, let's add a little bit of history in here, and let's add context with other food that comes into the region, it comes from the same area, and things like that. Ooh, where is the expression of flavor coming from? That was part of my idea of what a genre of literary criticism has been. And that's through, right, all of the work that I did on chocophile.com. It informed my book, Discover Chocolate, and the first decade or so of the chocolate life. Right? But as I have dug deep in that work, it has become more and more important to me, right, that that a defensible classification system, and I use the term encyclopedic, sort in the same sense that there was a descriptive narrative structure, right, that combines what it is that both Michael Jackson and Fred Eckhart did in their books, right? That's what I want to put together, right? That what that's going to happen is we're going to create a typological foundation, right, for a chocolate classification system. And then we can go from there into what it is the beer judging certification program is put together a formal competition structure, right? But before we can get to the formal chocolate competition certification program, chocolate judge certification program, we need to do this other work. And so that's what I'm going to be doing, right? It's what I have been doing, and it's what I'm really starting to focus on right now, is to take all of the research that I put together and put it together in a book. And I'm working on a book, right, in which all of this is going to become available. And I hope that it is something that the industry will embrace, right? Right. And I will be sharing bits and pieces of it with members of the Chocolate Life and the general public on future episodes of Pod Save Chocolate. And speaking of which, that is where I'm going to end today. And we're going to go up to the top and remind everyone that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate is sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life, right? If you're not a member, you can go click on the join button, which is in the top navigation of every page of the site, and you can join. There's always a free membership tier. You do get the monthly newsletters. You're not going to be hit with more than 1 or 2 emails a month from the site. If you are a member, memberships start as little as $5 a month. You will not only receive the monthly emails, but you'll get notifications for every single one of the podcast episodes. Show up in your mailbox. The entire thing will be emailed to you, or you can click on the link and visit it here on the website. Higher levels and annual tiers, right, include consulting hours, right? So if you want me to help you with your business in one respect or another, let me know, and become a premium member at a higher tier, an annual tier of the Chocolate Life, and that can happen. And that's it for today. I want to thank everybody who's watched today. For those who might watch in the future or while you're still here, like the Pod Save Chocolate channel, give a thumbs up, or subscribe to the Pod Save Chocolate channel, give a thumbs up to the video, put a comment in just to increase engagement. And remember that, this episode of you remember, and all of a sudden something else I know I need to do today just went to the top of my mind. But remember that if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody.